The government of Ukraine is warning that Russian President Vladimir Putin has his sights set far beyond Crimea or eastern Ukraine. The Ukrainian ambassador to Canada appeared before a parliamentary committee in Ottawa this week and put it this way.
It's important to realize that the biggest strategy of Russia is to expand its influence into the Mediterranean and into the Balkans. And Crimea, this red diamond in the middle, is very key to that strategy.
A broader perspective now on Russia's strategy and Ukraine's. Gwendolyn Sasse is the director of the Center for East European and International Studies and a senior fellow with Carnegie Europe. She spoke to us from Berlin. You have spoken about Ukraine as being central to Russia's relationship with the West. And these latest incidents in the Kerch Strait come at the same time as Vladimir Putin is having a pretty threatening conversation with Donald Trump about nuclear weapons at the same time. Help me understand what Putin's strategy is here.
Indeed, first of all, one has to point out that the last 2 weeks have really given us the sense that international security is very fragile again, and that international frameworks that are meant to deal with international security cannot be relied upon. A number of things have come together, but I would argue that Ukraine's central role in Russian-Western relations has been highlighted again by the military confrontation in the Kerch Strait and the broader issues around nuclear weapons and in particular the INF Treaty have existed for a while, but they've come to a head again in the wake of these events.
Why is Ukraine so central?
Because in 2014, in the wake of the Euromaidan protests in Kiev that brought about a regime change in Kiev, Russia went against international law to an extent that nobody in the West had accepted and expected. And since then, Crimea has effectively been controlled by Russia, and it seems unlikely that anybody in the West can do anything about it in the foreseeable future. In the wake of the annexation of Crimea, Russia has also actively supported and still supports a war in eastern Ukraine. The resolution of that war, that conflict, is not forthcoming despite international attempts to negotiate. And with the events in the Azov Sea, in the Kerch Strait, Russia has gone one step further. Elsewhere, I've called it Crimean annexation 2.0. So now Russia is also laying claim not only to the territory of Crimea, but also to the water around it. And by doing so, it has once again caught the West by surprise. And it highlights that international law is not a framework that can effectively regulate these kinds of conflicts at the moment. It shows that the West has also not paid sufficient attention to the events in and around Crimea and in the Azov Sea. We shouldn't have been so surprised when the military confrontation happened, because it's been part of Russia's strategy for a while to block the access to Ukrainian ports that need to be accessed through the Kerch Strait.
Do you think Putin has a greater goal here? What's his end goal?
First of all, there are concrete regional interests. Russia has strategic interests in the Black Sea area. It wants to control the sea, but also the territory there. But it also belongs to its strategy to weaken Ukraine as an independent state and as a state which controls all of its territory. And it uses every opportunity at the moment that presents itself to demonstrate this, that it can from outside weaken the Ukrainian state and also interrupt international consensus on how one should deal with principles like territorial integrity. Now, there are also signs internally that Putin, while he's still popular, is gradually becoming under greater pressure. And he has, for a long time now, derived part of his legitimacy through foreign policy. So the latest events in the Azov Sea, in the Kerch Strait, also have to be seen against the backdrop of domestic politics, where Putin can increase his popularity, at least in the short run, through actions like these.
I want to ask you also a little bit about the politics in Ukraine and what's at stake here for President Poroshenko. it's been suggested by some that basically some of the declaration of martial law, for example, was in effect a political move. Describe what's in this for him, what's at stake here.
There's a lot at stake for the Ukrainian President Petro Poroshenko, who faces presidential elections in March 2019. But before we discuss the internal situation in Ukraine, it is important to point out that Russia has broken international law and also a further agreement with Ukraine on the mutual use of the Kerch Strait and the Azov Sea. So that is a very important starting point. But nevertheless, it is also important to look at the dynamics inside Ukraine. And it is noticeable that the President Petro Poroshenko, who in the polls lags behind various other candidates, has also tried to build his election campaign around issues related to the war. So slogans like the army, the nation, the language, faith figure very prominently in his campaign. And so the instrumental use of aspects of this war with Russia are noticeable. Parliament had managed to reduce the martial law in its time frame from 60 to 30 days. That means that for the moment, the martial law does not affect the timing of the elections. But nevertheless, on the ground, it is in force in parts of Ukraine, in about half of the regions of Ukraine and the south and east of the country. But nevertheless, it disrupts everyday life, it creates uncertainty, it mobilizes, and it leaves the possibility that this law could be extended and then even elections could be postponed. So Poroshenko is definitely trying to benefit from the situation in terms of positioning himself as the war leader, but this could also backfire. This is not popular across the whole of the country. So it's a risky strategy, but perhaps the only one he has at the moment.
You mentioned a moment ago that the institutions around international law have failed to deal with this situation in any real way. There have been sanctions imposed. Canada and other countries have condemned what Russia has done in annexing Crimea. But what do you think actually could be done or should be done in this instance, particularly in the West?
Mm-hmm. The most important thing for the moment is to really work towards de-escalation, and that is what a number of Western governments, but also institutions like the EU, like NATO, like the UN have called for. Russia has not agreed upon a negotiation framework for the moment. It was suggested, among others, by the German Chancellor to use the Normandy format, which is the format that is meant to implement the Minsk agreement that should end the war in eastern Ukraine. This includes Germany, France, in addition to Ukraine and Russia. Russia has said that this format is not meant to deal with other issues, but at least the channels that underpin, the communication channels that underpin this format could be used going forward to try and de-escalate the situation on the ground. In a further step, what will be necessary is to once again come to a legal agreement on the use of the Kerch Strait and the access to the Azov Sea. The agreement between Russia and Ukraine from 2003 clearly doesn't hold anymore. What seems to be necessary is to include an element of international monitoring. There is discussion about including the sea, the maritime territory, in the OSCE monitoring mission. That could be one option. One could think of other options to monitor access through the Kerch Strait. At the moment, this will all be very difficult, but at least the groundwork needs to be laid for these discussions. Then there are also more discussions about sanctions. In the US, the process could be more direct in imposing sanctions. In the EU, this issue will be discussed next week when the regular EU Foreign Minister Council takes place. The existing sanctions, a whole set of sanctions, both in regards to or with regard to the Crimean annexation, but also the war in eastern Ukraine, they get rolled over every 6 months, and the consensus behind those inside the EU had become fragile. So I think at the least, as a minimum, this consensus is strengthened again, so we can expect these sanctions to continue. I'm doubtful that new sanctions will be added at this point, but this is an option that will be discussed. Beyond that, there are also partially military options that have been brought into the discussion. And the US, I think, is more willing to consider sailing a warship into the Black Sea, so near these events that have taken place. There has been a more cautious attitude on the part of NATO, because at the moment, Western military presence on the ground could, of course, also escalate the situation. And then one should not forget that the West and the EU, the US, could do a lot more to support Ukraine, for example, to rebuild infrastructure in eastern Ukraine around the ports that can now no longer be easily accessed, to strengthen the economic power of Ukraine again. And that is also one way in which one could start to change the balance of power a bit.
How real is the risk of war, do you think, of all-out war here?
The risk has increased significantly, not least because even though it was a small-scale military confrontation, these things can escalate and they can spiral out of control, and maybe they can also not always be controlled from, say, Moscow or Kiev. So this is definitely a very dangerous moment in time. And in addition to that, we have discussed that the broader framework of the INF Treaty is at stake as well. So we are somewhat ironically 30 years after the end of the Cold War, falling back behind the red lines that were drawn at the time. So there's less certainty now than there was even at that moment in time. Nevertheless, I would say that at the moment, neither Russia nor Ukraine have a real interest in escalating this to a full-out war. Russia is in a stronger position and can manipulate the situation at the moment. Ukraine is very much reacting to that. But a war is costly, and at the moment it seems sufficient for President Putin to demonstrate again and again that he can use and push the room for maneuver he has in dealing with Ukraine and with the West. But to go one step further does not seem to be in his interest either.
Thank you very much for your expertise on this.